All right, thank you for joining me today. My name is Michelle Proscia. I'm the Ag Educator over at Cornell Cooperative Extension in Sullivan County. And we're going to be working today or going through kind of on-farm composting. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video just so you know the video itself doesn't slow me down too much. So we'll just, I'm here, obviously you'll hear me talking, but if you need anything, you can put it in the chat box or we'll take questions at the end. I think I did it. Let's see. There we go. Okay. All right. So what we have coming on today, I can get my thing here. There we go. We have coming up we're going to go over the basics of composting, what the benefits are, you know, some of the elements, different composting systems, how to go about managing it, some kind of site environmental considerations, and FSMA regulations for composting, which is what I do want to touch on today for folks who are producing vegetables or produce, you know, fruits, things like that to the public, and we'll go over all that as well. Okay. So what is compost? In its very basic form, it's your basic controlled decomposition of organic materials by microorganisms. So those are the kind of little worker bugs here that is going to take your compost or take your raw compost and make it into kind of treated, complete compost at the end. So they're very important, and we're going to go through the basics on how to take care of them, because they're the workers that are going to do all the work. So basically what you're doing is you're taking raw organic material and you're going to turn it into soil amendments that you can use to fertilize your garden or your farm in that case. So those are things that are considered, such as like crop residues, animal waste, any kind of food garbage, and some municipal waste, you know, if you're doing it on a larger scale. Some benefits. So the whole reason why we are composting in the first place is because you want to make like a beautifully rich organic matter compost, and it's going to help increase your soil fertility. They call it the black gold, right? So what you're looking at is improving the soil without adding amendments that may cost money as well. So, you know, the better your compost is, the less money you have to put into your soil to kind of get it up to speed. So the benefit of compost is that, you know, when you add it into your soil, it's going to help your plants by resisting stress-related issues such as drought, disease, toxicity. It's going to help the crop itself by improving the uptake of plant nutrients. So the more nutrients and the more happy your soil is, the better it's going to be able to uptake into the plants that you're growing in the first place, which happy soil means happy plants, which, you know, happy farmer, right? So healthier the soil, there's going to be a need for less water because the holding capacity of the soil is greater, like the water holding capacity, so you don't have to water as much. You don't need as many chemical fertilizers because the soil itself is more resistant to disease pressure, and you know it's better at uptaking those nutrients, and you'll have the need for less pesticides as well if you have a good solid compost. If you are environmentally conscious, like most are, another benefit is that it reduces the organic waste material that has to be, you know, brought to the landfills or the dumps by 40 to 60%. It reduces the less waste that you have on your property as well if you can compost it properly. The other thing that is a benefit of compost is that it destroys weed seeds. So have you ever planted anything and had compost or, you know, some amendment to the soil, then all of a sudden you get all these different weeds or grasses or something extra growing in your garden or farm, field or something like that. That's because the compost itself wasn't properly treated. So the weed seeds in that compost that was originally there had the chance to grow again. So we'll talk about how to get through it and how to make sure that the weed seeds and all the other unwanted things in your compost bed get destroyed by heat. But so that is a good benefit, and especially if you have like an invasive species or anything like that that you don't want in your compost or in your fields, composting it is the best method to get rid of those weed seeds. Overall, it improves the soil structure and helps you till up the soil better. So again, if you go outside, well, not right now, it's pretty muddy out there. You're not going to see much, but in the middle of summer, if you go out and you're seeing that your soil is really hard, silty, or it's got a lot of clay and it's pretty dense, adding compost to it will help improve the soil structure itself. So that's another very important topic. And of course, proper composting reduces odor of the waste that you put in it as well. Okay, so now that we kind of got the basic of what compost is, we're going to talk about kind of the factors that affect the composting process. And I kind of think of this as like a recipe. You kind of need all these parts together for it to turn out its best. It's like making a cake. If you forget the eggs, like, you got a problem, right? So a part of composting is all these things here, which is moisture, proper oxygen aeration, temperature, particle size, pH, and carbon to nitrogen ratio with your nutrients, and of course time. On the left-hand side here, you can see kind of a little chart, I guess you could say. It's just, it's just your basic, that it's the compost pile. So all these raw materials go in along with oxygen. As the microorganisms heat up, water, heat, and everything is expelled, and then you get your finished compost at the end. But we'll go into a little more detail as well. So as we're going through this presentation here, I just want you to kind of get a good look at some of the pictures that I threw in. I tried to throw in different ones based on, some were farming, some were smaller scale, even larger scale. So just to get an idea, but it's all based on how you guys want to run your compost pile, whether it's with machinery or equipment, or the smaller scale with like turning bins, or even using a shovel, things like that. So just keep an eye on some of the pictures because they give ideas as well. So what is in the pile? What we're looking at is, you've probably heard this before, but it's the greens and the browns. There's kind of a steadfast, easy way to kind of get your pile going. But it's said that it's best to start with your browns on the bottom of your pile and end with browns. That way it keeps kind of the smell in and gets everything nice and cozy inside. So with your greens, you have your high nitrogen materials. That's things like manure. So any kind of manure that you have, the animal kind, any kind of hatchery waste, any excess fruits, vegetables, farm processing waste, things like that. And then, depending on, what type of operation you have, it can include fish processing waste as well. So obviously the things that are in, high nitrogen, they tend to be more smelly, right? So that's why you need to combine it with things that are brown. That helps kind of suppress the odor of that compost pile. So things that are high, excuse me, in carbon, yard trimmings, leaves, wood chips, you're on a farm, you know, sawdust, shavings, straw, old hay, super great to compost. Shredded paper, you know, some dairy barns have shredded paper for packing or bed pack. And if you're on a fruit farm, vegetable farm, you want to use the unwaxed cardboard. So that's important. A lot of boxes that vegetables and fruit go into are waxed, you know, so just make sure that the cardboard that you are using is unwaxed. Okay, so talking about the carbon nitrogen ratio. So this is the important thing here, that you're going through and you have the correct kind of ratio. The reason is because the microorganisms in your pile are what break down, you know, all the greens, all the browns, and make that compost, that black gold that you want for your soil, okay, as an amendment. So the microorganisms use the carbon for energy and growth, and then the nitrogen is what is essential for protein production and reproduction of those microorganisms. So you're going to feed them, house them, make them warm. You know, it's like a little house for them. So they need all the stuff that they need to grow and break down the material that you've put in there. So what you're looking for as a carbon to nitrogen ratio is generally 25 to 31 of carbon to nitrogen, of browns to green. Okay, so there are several calculators that are available. You know, that if you have, I have a chart coming up as well, but you know, if you have, you know, 100 pounds of manure, 10 pounds of green, you know, you got to do the calculation to kind of see how to get that ideal ratio of 25 to 30 to 1 is the best for active composting. You can go a little higher, a little below, but as you can see, I think on my next slide here, that anything below 20 to 1, you're not really giving the microorganisms what they need to be able to do their job. And that can lead to excess of ammonia and that odor. So compost isn't supposed to smell if you've done everything right. If you're starting to notice that your compost does smell after you've gotten it together, you're gonna want to adjust the carbon to nitrogen ratio or add more product to it to see if you can kind of balance it out, if it's kind of below that 20 to 1 ratio, because you don't want it to smell. And anything above, say 40 to 1, there's not enough nitrogen for that microorganisms to do their job. And it really slows down the process of composting. So it'll take much longer for the pile to heat up, the pile to cure, the pile to get ready to be used into your soil. So you want that sweet spot in the middle, say 20 to 30. So here's kind of a little chart I threw in that shows the carbon and nitrogen ratio of what things look like as far as the ratio goes. So you can see the browns, you know, sawdust, straw, 75 to 1, leaves. We have a lot of leaves out there. They're 60 to 1. Then you want to go down into your greens and you see that the ratio is a little bit less as far as like vegetable scraps, 25 to 1, manures, 15 to 1, grass clippings, 20 to 1. So this is where the calculator that you can plug in on, I'll show you the Cornell Composting website that has a great calculator in there as well as you can just find some online. But you're going to want to find that kind of 25 to 30 to 1 mixture. So somewhere in there, but these are kind of just gives you an idea of things that are kind of most commonly found in compost and how they look like as far as the carbon and nitrogen go. So next component, your compost pile needs oxygen in order to get going. So there's, you know, the two basics. that they talk about. It's aerobic composting and anaerobic composting, which simply means aerobic is with oxygen, anaerobic is without oxygen. So with aerobic composting, excuse me, you want to have your pile with enough oxygen in it that the microbes are able to begin to break down the product and heat it up. So we'll talk about particle size and things like that, but the best way to either get oxygen into your compost pile is by turning it, or they have, mechanical agitation, bigger equipment. But if you don't have that, something as simply as turning the pile, having the pile have access to oxygen, that helps speed up and heat up your pile. Of course, with anaerobic, without oxygen, it's a much slower process to compost. If you're really dense compost pile or wet compost pile, oxygen isn't getting in that pile and it's not able to start the composting process. So best way to get oxygen in is to turn your pile. And we'll talk about the different timings as far as turning could go. Moisture. So this is generally another important part along with oxygen. It needs to have some sort of moisture in there. It can't be all dry. You're looking at kind of like a 40 to 65% moisture is kind of the sweet spot in your pile. One way that you can determine what the moisture content is by using kind of a moisture meter. You can get them at like garden stores, and they're just a little probe that you stick in, and it kind of measures the moisture content on a scale. I've seen them a lot for, house plants. If folks want to know, should they water their plant? Yeah, you can just kind of get a probe and do that as well. Or you can just touch the compost. If you get in there and you're feeling it, you don't want it too moist where it's obviously too wet, but you want it to be moist to the touch. So you don't want to see dripping water everywhere, just moist enough where you feel it, that it kind of stays together in your hand if you squeeze it. So if it's not moist enough, or it's not within that 40 to 65% moisture range, you can always add water to it along with turning. That helps. Now, too much moisture can be a bad thing too, because it's not helpful. It decreases the amount of oxygen within the pile itself, because it's, kind of compacts the pile with all the material. So depending on your situation and how, if you have any structures or anything like that, you can always have it covered to kind of prevent, too much saturation of rain. Or, I have some pictures of some bins and things like that to kind of prevent oversaturation of the compost pile itself. But, what we're going for is 40 to 65% moisture. Now, particle size, I touched on this briefly here, but it's kind of like the three little bears. It's not too small, not too big, just right in the middle. So the smaller the particles, reduce how oxygen goes throughout the pile or the windrow. So what you want is kind of like a mix. You want particles that range from like 1/8 of an inch to 2 inch in diameter. So like wood chips and grass shavings and manure, and they all mix together so that there's some opportunity for airflow to kind of get in. You don't want them tight, too packed, where you're potentially doing anaerobic composting where there is no oxygen able to get through on the pile. And, that just slows the process. So you want to try and do it as best as you can by kind of mixing up the particle size to create airflow. Okay. pH, I just wanted to touch on this just briefly. It's not too important with the composting process, as far as like, it's not going to change too much. But generally, you know, if you are concerned about pH, the preferred range of compost pH would be, you know, 6.5 to 8 in pH value. But I did want to mention that say you are going to put compost in on, say, blueberries. I'll use blueberries as an example. Well, they like acidic soil, right? So if you're using your compost to amend the soil, you just want to be cognizant of what pH range you're putting in, because if you're putting it in on the higher range, you know, at the 8 pH value range, that can affect the pH of the soil that you have, where you want it to be acidic for blueberry growth production, right? So you might have to amend the soil further to get that acidic range back down, depending on the strength of the compost that you have. So that's really all I wanted to talk about on the value of pH. Just be aware of, if you're using compost for soil fertility and pH, if it's, you know, if you're growing acidic crops, just make sure that the pH won't completely get it out of whack. That's it. And then, of course, you know, the table here on the left kind of shows the pH increasing over time, and with the ammonia breakdown of the proteins, with like the longer that it sits in weeks, you can see that the pH will come down over time. So you're going to see that general 7 range, but just know that there is kind of a peak during the 2-week phase. So temperature. All right, so this is an important part, because if you don't heat up your pile, if your pile doesn't get hot enough, then you're not going to be able to do proper composting per se. So what they have is these fancy terms here: psychrophilic, mesophilic, and thermophilic, which just means it's your basic beginning, you know, not hot, a little bit hot. That's my basic breakdown of it. But you can see as the temperature goes, it's your upside down bell curve here, with the temperature at around like 130 to 160, you have the release of odors and the death of organisms like your weed seeds, any bacteria that might be in the compost pile, you know, E. coli, you know, different things like that can be remaining in the compost pile. You want to make sure that it gets heated up properly to that kind of 130 range. And that's where, you know, you get that release of odor, you know, it won't smell anymore, things like that. So the mesophilic and the thermophilic temperature range is the kind of most important part, and they're the ranges that composting takes place. So like I said, the thermophilic temperatures are desirable because they destroy those pathogens, those weed seeds, any fly larvae. We all know we don't need any more flies around, so you want to make sure that they heat up the pile best by using all the things that we spoke about before, with the oxygen, the correct carbon to nitrogen ratio, the moisture, and things like that. That itself will create the temperature conditions, and the pile will begin to heat up when the conditions are correct. So how do you know when your pile starts heating up? You can use, on the right-hand side, this is a composting, you know, temperature probe, and it's just it's a very long thermometer. And what you can do is you can take temperature readings to make sure your pile is heating up. And if it isn't, you can adjust it by either adding more water or turning the pile to create more oxygen. But you're going to want to keep a record of that as well, so you know that the compost is properly curing and setting. So during the psychrophilic and the mesophilic stage, those microbes multiply, they start to give off heat, and the pile starts to get hot. Then it moves on into the thermophilic phase, or that hot phase, where all the bacteria and the microorganisms consume the food, and it heats up even hotter to that 130, 150 range. And at this point, you're seeing water, heat, and carbon dioxide being given off of the pile. And then after that, it'll start to have a cool down where the microbes run out of water or food, and it cools down. Now, if your pile hasn't reached the proper temperature yet, you can always reactivate that pile by turning it or adding water to get that to heat up again. Excuse me, one of the big questions I get when talking about compost is, well, how long does it take, And that's kind of hard to kind of nail down a time, because it's all dependent on the pile itself. It's its own entity, it's its own creature kind of thing. So it all depends on the materials that you put in, the temperature that it gets to, how long that takes, moisture level, have you turned it a lot, or different user requirements. So does it have to reach a certain temperature for a certain amount of days? Is there a certain curing process that you need to hit? We'll talk about that a little bit, but it's hard to kind of pinpoint it down. But generally, depending on the compost itself, it can be finished in a few weeks if the best conditions are met, or it can be finished months, or even a year if you have just a standard manure pile, that doesn't get turned, doesn't have any browns in there. It can take a while if you just have it just sitting. So once you've gone through everything, you added all your browns and greens, all the moisture is correct, the oxygen's correct, you hit your temperature goals. Then at the end, once things are no longer reheating after you're turning them, then it goes into the curing process, which usually is about 3 or 4 weeks. And this is that kind of final step to make sure that your compost is completed and, ready to be used. So you want to make sure that you do go through this curing process, that the pile's not reheating up anymore, because any kind of, say, immature compost can have high levels of organic acid in that compost. And when you add it to your soil with your crops, that could lead to kind of, damaging of that plant. So you don't want to do that, obviously, because you're adding compost to make sure that they're happy and healthy, and you don't want to hurt them, right? So you just want to make sure that you go through the curing process, and then the pile no longer heats up. And then after that, you'll have that black gold and that beautiful compost that you can be able to add to your fields or gardens to make excellent produce here. So here is a chart real quick about the kind of typical composting times. Now, this is just a general chart. So again, things can be a little sooner, things can be a little later. But you can see here with kind of, passive composting, that's just putting it in a corner, not touching it, not leaving it. It can take, with just leaves, it can take like 2 to 3 years to break down, or 6 months with some well-bedded manure in there. A windrow, which is kind of like, I had a picture of it, but it's kind of like that long triangle pile that extends down a row. So with infrequent turning of a windrow, you're looking at kind of like 4 to 8 months. With frequent turning, active turning, of the windrow, making sure all the conditions are right, you can get everything down in about 1 to 4 months. You have kind of a rectangular agitated bed or aerated static pile. Those go much quicker. I'll show you what an aerated static pile looks like, but that can go, 3 to 5 weeks. The rectangular bed is about 2 to 4. And those rotating drums you see a lot in gardens on the smaller scale. They have much larger ones, of course, for farming, but mostly what you see is the smaller ones. And they can be done kind of 3 to 8 days. So they're much, much quicker. So, and then don't forget about the curing time afterward to make sure everything's copacetic and happy and not reheating up. So here is a nice chart for your kind of go-to ranges, what you're looking at for those factors for composting. Let's go over them again real quick here. So you're looking at your carbon to nitrogen ratio around 25 to 30 to 1. Moisture content somewhere in the 50 to 60% range. Particle size, reasonable range is eighth of an inch to ½ inch, 2 inches, somewhere in there, but a good blend. pH, we talked about that. That's 6.5 to 8%, or 6.5 to 8 for pH. And your temperature ideally would be 130 to 140, somewhere in there, to make sure that the bacteria, any weed seeds, any egg larvae are killed by the heat. Okay. So that's the basics of how you compost. So I wanted to show you a couple different on-farm composting systems to give you an idea of what it looks like. So here's the windrow that I described a second ago here. For this, this is obviously out in the field here, and the pile itself is able to be turned, probably with a backhoe or some kind of mechanical larger machine than just a shovel, because that would be a lot of shoveling, in my opinion. But the temperature of that pile should be maintained at 131 degrees Fahrenheit or higher for 15 days or longer. So that means that you're going to want to have to go out there and use your temperature probe to make sure that it's kind of maintaining itself at 131 degrees or higher. And if it's not, you can add to it with water or with oxygen, aerate it, turn the pile over. But with this turn pile or windrow composting, you want to make sure that during that period when the compost is maintained at 131 degrees or higher, there's about 5 turnings of that pile. So say if everything is right, you're going to want to turn them at least 5 times during that 15-day period. So however that works best for your schedule. But the idea is to keep that temperature up and throughout the course of those 15 days. Now this is called an aerated static pile. So this is different. So the idea here is aerated, so to add oxygen. Static means not moving. So you wouldn't have to technically turn this pile because you're adding oxygen in it here. Now there's several different kind of methods or plans that you can view online of how to do this aerated static pile. But the basic here is this farmer built basically a system using PVC pipe with holes down where the pipes come out here that have holes in them, so that he's forcing air through that pile to create increased oxygen. Okay, so that would be what you're looking for. And at that point, if you have this type of operation, that you can you'd only have to maintain the 131-degree temperature for 3 consecutive days, and it would be able to kill off the microbes and, or I'm sorry, not the microbes, the bacteria, E. coli, the fly larvae, all that stuff that we talked about under these optimum conditions here. So you just want to make sure that you do get that 131 degrees for at least 3 days. As far as timing for like how long do you have to shoot air into this system, it all depends. I've read where, you know, some folks do it for 20 minutes, you know, every day, and that worked well for them as far as getting their pile done, or, you know, only a couple minutes, but it all depends on your pile itself. So you're just going to have to experiment to see how it goes, so you can get that pile up to temperature by adding the oxygen to it. Then there, of course, is that non-aerated static pile composting, which just means, you know, it's a pretty dense, there's no oxygen being shot into it. Static means you're not moving that pile. And that itself is going to take much, much, much longer, that we talked about on that chart back there. But the compost itself, it will take a long time to break down. So if you have the time, or you just want to put it off to the side and come back to it in a good amount of months or a year, then that's one version of a composting system that you can have. Then in addition, the in-vessel composting, these are composting materials that are confined within a building or container or vessel, and generally have kind of that forced air or mechanical turning to accelerate the process. So I do have pictures, you know, you'll see them like 3 different bins, 3 different bays, or different things like that. They have kind of, there's different plans that you can view online where the building itself is made for composting, where there's slats in the floor that you can make sure that air gets through, so it kind of aerates your compost pile as well. And or you just do mechanical composting, you know, using like a bucket loader or something like that to turn the compost pile. So here's some of the bin method. Again, the one on the left here has a roof, which is nice to keep kind of you know, rain away from it. The one on the right doesn't. But one thing I would say for using kind of the bay system is you always want to have kind of one bay open. So if you're turning your pile, you know, you can move it into another bay, and that way you have a place to put your compost, and then you can turn the next pile by moving into the next open bay. Things like that. Just little tips to help make things easier. And you can also see on the right-hand side, there is additional wood chips available if the compost needs a little help in heating up. Okay. So now moving on into FSMA compliance here. And one main thing that I want to talk about is that for the FSMA produce safety rule, so that this FSMA course is a course in and of itself. So this is a course for anybody who is farming and who either A, has to comply with the law based on average annual produce sales, or depending on where they sell their food to, or what is required of them by who they sell it to. But FSMA produce safety rule is an FDA rule, and it's the first ever mandated federal standard for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh produce. So the whole idea is that it we've had a lot of food safety risks in our country in the past. I mean, you've seen it with, melons, spinach, lettuce recalls. You see it on the news every once in a while that someone gets sick or unfortunately passes away from, an E. coli outbreak from, produce. So what the federal government did was kind of put together this FSMA, or Food Safety Modernization Act, for produce safety. And the whole idea is to reduce food safety risks on your farm. It's an excellent course. I recommend you take it if you have a farm or just want to know more about how to reduce food safety risks on your farm. So depending on the size of the farm that you have, there are exemptions as well. So if you like only grow products that are basically rarely consumed raw, like potatoes, you're kind of exempt from the rule because usually there's like a kill step to decrease the amount of pathogen risk or E. coli, say, on a particular product. So, but I don't know of any strictly just potato growers in our area specifically. So generally you'll have other products as well. In addition, you can be eligible for an exemption on this if you process your foods that include a kill step or something that heats it up. And, depending on your annual produce sales and annual food sales to qualified end users, you might also be available or able to have an exemption. But regardless of that, it's a great course and you should check it out to see how to learn all about how to reduce food safety risks on the farm. But in terms of composting and FSMA, there is a regulation specifically for composting and how it all pertains in the certain amount of time that you have to compost. But I'll get into that in a second. So the basics with animal manure, you want to make sure that you kind of know the basics of it. So all manure can carry human pathogens. These pathogens tend to be what get people sick. So composting itself is an example of how to reduce the amount of pathogens in the soil or on a product, because there's a kill step in the composting process that heats up and kills those pathogens. But many animals shed pathogens at different times in their life. They can shed more pathogens based on their age, how they're raised, their diet, the season, and the environmental conditions. So the point is, like, if you're using animal manure in compost, to just understand how and why the heating up step in composting is very important. So for FSMA, they have certain language on how they categorize soil amendments. So you have untreated soil amendments, and they're considered the highest risk. So untreated biological soil amendments of animal origin, meaning they come from an animal, are considered high risk since they have not been treated to reduce or eliminate pathogens. So again, no kill step or no heating up step. So any time that you're using anything like raw manure, aged or stacked manure, manure teas, slurries, or any soil amendment mixed with raw manure, those are considered highest risk in terms of pathogen load on your farm. So what they want you to do is to do the composting method so it can reduce all those pathogens and have a less chance for folks to get sick, which is what we all want. So treated soil amendments or composting reduces those pathogens and decomposes the organic matter within the compost. So with FSMA, the only treatment process that has, well, they only want you to use a treatment process that has been scientifically validated to ensure pathogen reduction. So that's with checking on temperature and time. So that's the validated scientific process. Okay. So it's, we already talked about it. Using the aerated static composting method. So it's at a minimum 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days, followed by proper curing to make sure that the compost pile doesn't heat up again. Or using the turn composting method, it's a minimum of 131 degrees for 15 days with 5 turnings. So those are the basic scientifically valid processes to composting that are regulated by FSMA. So if you have to follow FSMA standards, these are the ways that you would have to use compost on your field. So again, it's all about reducing risks when it comes to FSMA. So you're not going to want to apply soil amendments containing manure to crops not intended for fresh consumption. Or I'm sorry, if you must use soil amendments containing manure, use it on crops that are not intended for fresh consumption. Okay. You want to maximize the time between your application of your compost and harvest. And you want to make sure that the compost or manure that you're using does not contact the edible portion of the crop during application, because that's where, you know, E. coli can attach to surfaces, or, you know, it rains and it can splash onto your crop. So you just want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to reduce the risks. You don't want to side dress with raw manure. And, you know, if you're spreading manure in a field adjacent to your fruit or vegetables, you know, you want to make sure to manage the risks associated with that. You know, think of drift with wind, or, you know, if it's downhill, if it rains, you just, you know, manure can go a lot of places. So just keep things in mind like that. So in FSMA, they talk about a minimum application interval, but currently they haven't narrowed it down on what the minimum application interval would be between harvest and, you know, putting down your compost. So for untreated soil amendments, you know, those are things like straight manure or raw manure. So the FDA is currently figuring out how to support application intervals for raw manure. But right now they say just make sure that your raw manure is not directly applied to the harvestable portion of the crop. Now for treated soil amendments, you know, compost that's treated by a scientifically validated process, there's a 0-day application interval, because technically there should be no E. coli, there should be no pathogens in that treated compost. So there's a 0-day application interval for that. However, if you are in the organic realm or unsure about the application interval itself, a lot of times farmers fall back on the organic regulations for raw manure just to be safe. But this is what the regulation states, is that raw animal manure must be composted unless it is incorporated into the soil not less than 120 days prior to the harvest of a product whose edible portion has direct contact with the soil surface or soil particles. So think about the different crops that you grow, and, if they're growing under the ground, lay on the ground, or above the ground, or incorporated into the soil not less than 90 days prior to the harvest of a product whose edible portion does not have direct contact with the soil surface or soil particles. So that is what the organic regulation states. So if you are organic, you're always going to follow the 90-120 day method. If you're doing raw animal manure, if it's treated by a scientifically validated process, the compost itself, then you don't have to deal with the 90 or 120 day, which can be hard depending on the crop that you're trying to grow. Okay. So I did want to touch on this. So when you are placing or identifying a place to put your compost, it's super important that you kind of identify any chances for runoff or leaching that can adversely affect your crops or water sources or handling areas. So, if you put your compost pile at kind of on a slope, when it rains, you're going to see all that leaching going down the field or the road or whatever you're on. You just want to reduce the chance of that happening. So you can do things like you can cover your pile, or you can build berms around the pile itself to kind of prevent runoff. Ones that are in covered structures don't really have a leaching issue, but you definitely want to make sure that that doesn't get into waterways for sure. So, and then in addition, you want to make sure that if you have livestock on your property or animals, you want to do your best that you can to try and minimize animal access to those compost piles. And hopefully, if all goes well and right, that the compost piles themselves, they are not smelly, right? So they're not going to attract critters to your compost pile. So that is the goal in that sense. So for FSMA, there is certain record keeping requirements that go along with soil amendments or compost. So if you're using any soil amendments or compost on your fields that can introduce microbial risk, you would have to document for FSMA standards. And for documentation, that's something as simple as, keeping the receipt or writing it down on a piece of paper in your notebook. And it just goes through, the type and source of the soil amendment, the application and the rates that you used on your field, any kind of handling or sanitation practices that might reduce the risk when you're using that. And as far as additional record keeping, you want to make sure that you do keep record of the compost pile that you are creating. So you want to make sure that you have the proper time of your compost, like the 3 days, 15 days, the temperatures. Did you take the temperature, every day to make sure that it had the minimum temperature requirement for the minimum amount of days, any turnings that you did, or any other kind of processing steps that you had. So this is record keeping for FSMA, but if you are composting anyway, and if you're selling your compost, this is stuff that farmers would want to know, that that the compost itself is up to speed and, of a scientifically valid process. Okay, so I also wanted to touch on mortality composting because it is an excellent way to compost mortalities on your farm, especially, I mean, we've had knock on wood, a little bit of a mild winter here, but composting itself is a great way to get rid of any issues that you have in your farm. So don't worry, I don't have any graphic pictures or anything like that. But for mortality composting, the idea is that you want to layer about 24 inches deep of bulky absorbent wood material, like wood chips. And you're going to put that down on the ground. And depending on the size of the animals that you have, if you have a cow versus chickens versus goats, whatever it may be, pigs, that would determine kind of the how big your pile itself would be. But on the bottom, you want to make sure you have at least 24 inches on the bottom. And you want to make sure that you have about 2 feet clearance of that wood material around the carcass itself. So when you're mortality composting, adding all these, the wood material plus the carcass, when you cover that carcass back up with another 2 feet of wood chips, it's going to start heating up pretty rapidly, and you're not going to have this kind of smell. It's also a good idea, depending on the animal, to lance the rumen to avoid bloat or an explosion in that case, because as a decomposition process goes along, gases get heated up inside the body. So you want to make sure that you lance the rumen to avoid kind of like the explosion or the bloat. So like I said, after you put the carcass in the middle, cover it with about 2 feet of wood chips, and you want that kind of chunky carbon source. So here's kind of your example with a cow here. I think it's a cow. Yes. So 2 feet on the bottom, 2 feet surrounding it. And that temperature is going to heat up pretty rapidly because of all the microbial activity. And it's going to heat up to about 120 to 150 degrees within about 24 hours. So things go pretty quickly. And, depending on the animals that you have, if you have, let's just use chickens, for example. You want to layer, and you have a lot that you have to compost. You're going to want to layer them in a single layer. And then if you need to do an extra layer on top, you're going to want to have that 2 foot bedded pack in between, about 1.5 feet, 2 feet in between, to make sure that everybody has enough carbon to start the process itself. So if you're layering, make sure that you have an additional layer of the woody absorbent material in between the carcasses. So composting itself takes around, for your largest animal, 4 to 6 months. And what you'll be left with is bones. So in that composting pile, once the composting process is complete and you take out your bones, you can use that compost as well. Okay, so these are some of the resources here. I highly recommend going to the Cornell Waste Management Institute. I've listed the website address here, but you can also give it a Google. The Composting Handbook, Produce Safety Alliance for FSMA information, and I did want to throw in the Cornell vermicomposting site. I was going to talk about that today as well, but it would have been a pretty long presentation, I think, here as well. So I just wanted to throw some information out on that. So if anybody does want more information, I'd be happy to talk you through it or reach out. And with that, I will open it up for questions here. But I thank you for joining me.